Hello. Today we're going to be talking about the elements of three-dimensional design. What does that mean? What is the elements of three-dimensional design? It's those qualities of a design that can be seen and worked with independently of a figurative content. And the elements of design, they include line, form, light, space, texture, color, and time. And sometimes light is replaced with the word value. Okay, so I've seen enough to say that you could probably use either or. Okay, so why don't we go ahead and begin to start talking about it? The first thing we're going to talk to is about line. So what is line? In areas whose an area whose length is considerably greater than its width, or in which two planes are touched. Okay. Now, I'm going to go ahead and show you guys some artwork that uses line. As we go through it, and I kind of give you a little bit of a definition, this is just a little taste of all the elements of design. In further chapters, we're going to break this down one by one. So again, I'm just giving you just a little bit of what each element of design means. So let's take a look at this one, lines within forms. So if we take a look at this artwork, we can see multiple different lines. Okay, so we see these ridged lines, we see these lines, okay, even this line. So there's a lot of lines, and they're all within this sort of ceramic vase. If we take a look at this piece, this is a linear line. If we look at this, a linear work, look at this, this is just made with wire, and you can just kind of follow along with it. So this really becomes a very, very linear work. Then we could take a look at this piece. This is an implied line. Implied lines, you visually don't see them, but they're sort of there. So I like taking this piece, it's called the thorn puller. And if we look at it, his eye line is looking at his foot, trying to pull out the thorn. And even though you can't actually physically see the line, it's still present in the work. So let's talk about form. Form is the volume and shape of a three-dimensional work, perhaps including unfilled areas and an integral to the work as a whole. Okay, so let's kind of take a look at this. So here's again some artworks primarily using form as an element of design. So if we take a look at these, pretty familiar piece, right? The pyramids of Giza. They're static form. So what do we mean by static form? Non-moving. Those things are not going anywhere. That doesn't mean that a static form is not exciting. It just means that it's just not moving. Those aren't going anywhere. Usually static form also becomes sort of timeless, universal, grounded, powerful. Okay. If we take a look at the second one, we talk about negative and positive form. So what do we mean by that? Positive form is actual physical form. So we can look at the physical shape of this piece, okay? But we also have negative form. What does that mean? It's sort of the empty space. So if we look at this, there's actually a form or a shape that's created in the middle. It's part of delineated space. And so that's what makes that a negative form. So it's got a little bit of both. If we take a look at this piece, external versus internal form, we've got two different forms here, right? We've got this solid form here, okay, which seems like almost like a big rock, but this little window here tells us that there's something that's going on inside the piece. There's an actual interior form to this. And so that's why we're talking interior versus exterior form. The next thing we're talking about is light. And again, I can use value here. You usually will find it in two-dimensional elements of two-dimensional art. But, for our purposes, we'll go ahead and use light. And what is light? Light in art includes using actual light, the lighting of artwork, how a light source might interact with an artwork, the use of reflections, and the using light itself as an aesthetic. Okay, so let's go ahead and take a look at it. So these artworks primarily use light as an element to design. James Turtle piece, if we look at this, this is considered ambient light. Just a little bit of light makes that interior space feel really dramatic. Okay, even a little bit, a hint of purple color there to give it this little bit of a glow. If we take a look at the piece in the middle, the natural light of a Dal Chihuly piece, the sun sort of really gets this to kind of glow, and it almost has its own natural light to it. Okay, and then the third way, we can take a look at Dan Flavin's, where he's really using artificial light to create his artwork. You can see all these sort of neon lights that create sort of this room. I think he's using mirrors in there too. I'm not entirely sure. Just kind of a neat piece that uses artificial light. Talk about space. Space is the three-dimensional field with which the artist works, including both filled and unfilled areas. So if we take a look at this, we sort of talked about this a second ago in some ways. Here we have delineated form in space. What does delineated form mean? It's this negative space that's created by this positive form. And delineated means that it's actually fully enclosed. So it's kind of like a picture frame, right, for the backdrop of that beautiful landscape. In here we see activated surrounding space by Henry Moore's piece. And so why do we say you're activating space? It's very similar to the thorn puller. If we look, we see her eye lines looking out past the room, and the child too is looking outward at something. Well, we're filling the space with those eye lines because they're looking at something. And so they're creating more space than the object itself takes up. And it's simply, eye lines are a great one for that. Okay, if we take a look at this piece, Rebecca Lewis Law's piece, we're talking about confined space. What does that mean? It means it's sort of within a specific area. We know the artwork doesn't exist beyond that, which is sort of the opposite of activating surrounding space. So we can see installation art can usually fill that if we put all that artwork within a room, okay? And then that creates confined space. And again, as I talk about all of these, there's like, I could talk about space for a week. I could talk about space, time for a week. There's a lot of different areas. I'm just highlighting just a couple of areas. We'll get into it a little later in the semester. Let's begin to talk about texture. All right, texture. What is texture? Texture is the tactile surface characteristic of a work of art that is either felt or perceived visually. Let's take a look at this. These artworks primarily use texture as an element of design. So if we look at this, we have natural texture by Walter D. Maria as the artist, and just putting dirt in a museum or gallery and just kind of filling the floor. Well, you're not really altering that material in any way. You're just sort of putting it in its natural state and creating an artwork from that. Now, if we take a look at this is a piece of wood, right? But it's worked texture. Okay, so we see the ridges on there, we see the shape on there. We've carved all of this out to create this really interesting worked texture. If we take a look at the piece on the right, we talk about visual texture. Sheila Hicks, really known as a fiber artist, spent many years creating some really good pieces. So if we take a look at this, look at her work behind them, we can visually know what that texture feels like, right? It's going to feel really soft, really comfortable. There's something really nice about that. Now, we can think about visual texture too, even if we had an artwork that had broken glass, right? Because what does that say? Well, you're not going to want to touch that. So just by visually looking at it, you get a sense for what that may feel like. All right, let's talk about color. What is color? The phenomenon of light, such as red, brown, pink, or gray, or visual perception that enables one to differentiate otherwise identical objects. All right, so just we really want to think about it as, color, red, blue, green, how we might want to use that. So if we look at these artworks, primarily use color as an element of design. So let's just talk about natural color. So if we take a look at this necklace of Louis Comfort Tiffany, look at that beautiful jewel in the middle of that. He didn't have to do anything with that, maybe just polish that um, jewel opal up. He's just going to let the natural color show itself for what it is. Okay, and sometimes you'll see that even in artists that use stones, wood. Okay, so really the use of that natural color. If we take a look at applied color, we can take a look at Sergei Itsapov's piece, and we really see the use of color, right? Matte surface, we've got the beautiful red, we've got the really interesting yellow. Really just the artist is adding color to make the artwork stand out. And so we see this really in this particular case. Now, if we take a look at the piece on the right, this is where we're starting to talk about the effects of color, psychological. And so if we look at this, these light green, this is about the Great Depression. And so there's a sense of gloominess, sort of a psychological thing that's played when we take a look at this piece. And it's all these guys lined up to go in this door. Maybe it's a food shelter or something, a food pantry. Let's talk about time. What's time? Time implies change and movement. Movement implies the passage of time. Movement and time, whether actual or illusionary, are crucial elements in art, although we may not be aware of it. And artwork may incorporate actual motion, that is, the artwork itself moves in some way. Okay? So these are artworks that primarily use time as an element to design. So let's take a look at this. This is, from my hometown, Chicago. That's a sculpture that's out in front of the United Center of the most famous basketball player, Michael Jordan. And this is a good example, illusion of movement, right? So you really get a sense that he's moving through air, and in a moment later, he's going to be either dunking the ball or somewhere else. But this statue hasn't changed at all since it's come out of its casting. But you really do get a sense of movement there. And you can even see it in this figure that's kind of getting pushed aside, right? Now, if we take a look at this piece, it controls time. So if we look at it, there is like each panel in each area sort of goes through time, okay, begins to tell a story from the beginning to the end in sort of this chronological order as you sort of go up. I think this is called the Trajan column. It's in Rome. And if you look at it again, it gives the passage of time. Another way we can talk about time is a sense of timelessness. Michelangelo's famous David, which I know I've shown you before, I always like to show this. But, the human figure is sort of a timeless thing. So whether we're creating artwork that's, 2,000 years ago or yesterday, the human figure always appears timeless. Okay. And so those are the elements of design and how they relate to three-dimensional. Again, my name is Lou Pierozzi, and I hope you enjoyed my PowerPoint presentation.